So we're going to pick up where we left off last time. We remember that last time we made it all the way through uh, 1/3 of the first verse of John 1, and we talked about how the Word was God, most likely rendered. Um, and this time around, we hope to finish off parts A and B. And I want to observe something here is that in each section, there's one word that we're focusing on that sort of sets the stage for understanding the whole theme. It's be sort of a pivotal point of understanding. Um, and so last time we saw that this word theos, right, uh, that it most likely doesn't mean God himself, because it doesn't have the definite article and because of other elements in the grammar. Interestingly enough, to look at the actual odds, we said were 94% odds that that where it says the word was God, that what it's talking about is God-like. In other words, the characteristics of God. So that we might say, for example, whatever some versions will say what God was, the Word was, um, or some would say uh, the Word was God-ish or God-like. In any case, the logos had the attributes of God is basically what it's saying, or it could be saying that the logos was the attributes of God. Either way. So there were three different possible ways of rendering it. And we want to say it's almost sort of a inversely proportional when you look at how it's most likely to be rendered versus how many people actually sort of belong to congregations that would hold that viewpoint for that particular favored translation. So these numbers, by the way, are just sort of me synthesizing some statistics, and some of them are pretty rough estimates. We weren't actually given the odds of of part C of verse 1:1 rendered as God himself, or indefinite, like these two. All we know is that they combined make up estimated 6%. So it could be 5% and 1%, or vice versa. We're not sure. But in any case, we know that it's 94% that it should say something like godlike. And I wanted to touch on really quickly what the difference is with Arianism versus what we believe. Arianism actually, they believe that Jesus had a beginning, but that he began his beginning pre-existing as some sort of a spirit creature, like an angel or whatever. Like that's how JWs believe. They believe that Jesus pre-existed as Michael the archangel, and Christadelphians believe that Jesus was what he began his existence as a personal, self-aware, rational being, either his conception or his birth or somewhere in that. As he grew in stature and wisdom, he began to reach like this consciousness state, right? That he wasn't pre-existing. He didn't have any kind of superhuman advantage or anything like that. So we find out, though, in history that Arianism was actually flourishing in the 2nd century AD, through the works of Justin Martyr. Mentions that he mentions it in his time. There were some who were other Gentiles, other Greeks, who held that Jesus was what he called a man of men, which which means that he was just, a man. He didn't pre-exist. He said this in the context of, I'm not going to get in an argument right now with a Jew about pre-existence. But he says, but there are some of my race who believe that Jesus was a man of men. In other words, that he was an ordinary human, that he wasn't pre-existing. So it looked like Justin Martyr was probably an Arian at least. I'm not sure if he believed that Jesus was God himself, but that belief did actually eventually come into play later. Of course, it became church doctrine a few centuries later. So what we believe now it's referred to as the Socinian view, that the divine plan was expressed when Jesus was born, that before his birth, he didn't exist except for in the mind of God, and through God's word. So that's just sort of a summary, though. It's sort of interesting. The numbers are sort of flip-flopped if you look at them here. Just wanted to make that point, and as we're looking at what we saw last time in John 1:1c. Now, when we move on to part B, sort of rewinding, going backwards, I did that intentionally. So the big question in 1:1b is this word with, where it says the word was with God, the Greek pros. And the question is, what does that mean? Because how you interpret that word can have some bearing on how you interpret what is the logos in this verse. So what is the meaning of logos is kind of ultimately what we're after, but we're picking apart the different things it's saying about it here. So it's an important question because if you thought that pros here was meant that the logos was toward God, you could interpret that as possibly meaning a personal relationship, companionship. You could possibly force here the logos to be a personal being. But if you simply understood pros, the word pros here to mean with, then it could be something impersonal, like a concept word. The logos could be a purpose or an intent. So God having his purpose with him. And sometimes the Strongs can be helpful, but I don't think so much here it's very helpful. Even at least not telling us how it should be rendered in John 1:1. Even if we did know, yes, that it's using the accusative case grammar, Strong's isn't giving us really the entire story here. And incidentally, notice how that here theos has the definite article, right? So this one's definitely talking about the God, or that's the Greek way of saying that God himself, the definitive case, unlike we saw in 1:1c. And in 1:1a, it turns out to be a good idea to look at parts A and B at the same time. And in a moment, I'll explain why that is. But first, I thought I'd just like to give a glimpse at the grammar here too, because I know that we all love grammar. The focus here is on the word beginning, right? So what does the word beginning here, what is it referring to? There's more than one possible meaning. And in fact, Christadelphians have differences of opinion here on this point. In fact, there's some well-known Christadelphians that had the opposite opinion of me, and there's probably some that have the same opinion as me, and then you might not have the same opinion as me, but that's fine. I'll present my case, and then at least as best as I can. But so Christadelphians can be somewhat divided on this point. But what I've done here is list here. These are just the two meanings that are the most sort of popular in Christadelphia. And you could totally see how that whichever one you choose here could steer how you interpret what is the logos here, or vice versa. They're all sort of related. How you understand one is going to influence how you understand the other and steer your belief system about what is logos in this verse. And before moving on, I'm going to point out, of course, as several others have, that the Septuagint rendering of Genesis 1:1 in the beginning in Arche is exactly the same Greek words here. So it's so whether or not you take the beginning here to refer to the natural creation or to refer to some later creation, that's either way, you're pretty much forced to agree that there's at least an allusion to the Genesis creation here within Arche. So when we take these two together, what I've done here is kind of look at all the possible combinations of what you get when you look at, in the beginning, the two different possible choices, and what does the word with mean in here, and whether with here has to imply that the logos is a personal being facing toward God, or whether the logos being with God simply could actually refer to God having his purpose with him, in a sense that possibly where with the word being with him might just mean that it hasn't been spoken yet, or it hasn't been written yet. It could mean that, or it could mean several other things, as we'll see. But it's just useful, I think, to evaluate these two verses together. And I think it helps eliminate some of the confusion. Now, obviously, on the lower quadrant here, if you have the beginning referring to Genesis and you have a personal Jesus being with God, then you have the problem of the pre-existence, right? And then you'd have a problem with Jesus not being a man. So that's why I colored that red, basically crossed that one out. And on this one here, if you were to take the beginning as like the beginning of Jesus's ministry, and you were to take the logos as meaning not Jesus, but a purpose, not only does it not make sense to say it that way when you think about it, but also where it says that the world was made by him, by Jesus, that wouldn't make sense unless it was the new creation. But then it turns around and says that the world knew him not. So I've had a problem struggling with, well, how could the world here be talking about the new creation if it knew him not? The new creation is the creation that did know Jesus, I would think. So we have kind of an issue here with a new creation that doesn't know Jesus, if that's what it means. So I've just thought this quadrant here, this combination of what is the beginning and what is with mean, didn't make any sense to me. So I went ahead and crossed that out. I'm trying to narrow the problem down a little bit here. So now we have two views to evaluate. And the view that works for me is this view here, verse saying that God has with him a purpose, and he's had it from the beginning. And this other view is argued by Brother Harry Whitaker in the Studies in the Gospels. And I will say that I do agree with Brother Harry in how that he holds John 1:1 verse C, part C. He says it should be read as the Moffat translation. The word was divine. And I'm like, okay, I'll go along with that. But after weighing in on all the evidence on both ways of looking at this verse, I don't necessarily agree with him in his interpretation of part A and B. I'll be the first to agree that Harry Whitaker was a very insightful and a brilliant man, and he was a very original thinker. He was a very deep student, but that doesn't necessarily make somebody always right, and we're still supposed to question what people say, what other people believe according to our own studies. And in some cases, I see brilliant brethren going off track simply because they didn't have all of the knowledge at their disposal that we have today. So I think at least in my understanding, that's kind of the case here. And when I went through Brother Whitaker's writing, I counted whopping 8 points of where he's addressing what he sees as wrong. He's bringing up points against this view. And of those 8 points, I reckon 3 as very weak, too weak to be conclusive. I saw 1 was obviously a straw man argument, maybe intentionally, maybe not. 3 were just wrong, and 1, the last one of the 8 I saw as sort of a yeah, but in other words, I concede the point, but I think there's stronger evidence pointing the other way still. So I don't want to get into the minutia of addressing all of his points here, but I would like to address what I thought was his strongest point, and for me the most difficult is that, again, how do you translate that with, right? That with in part B, and there's different ways to interpret that pros, rendered in the King James as with. The logos was with the theos. And here's what Brother Harry said about it. This Greek preposition is one which normally carries the idea of facing toward or moving towards. And then he quotes Dr. Thomas here saying that here is companionship. But I think he's wrong. And when I look up the BDAG, the BDAG is 3rd edition, is modern, very scholarly and highly respected lexicon, uses all of the known writings of the time to try to figure out what words meant. And it's pretty much the most respected authority on what word meanings are from biblical texts, and the last word, sort of, as it were. And lexicons are not very easy to read, by the way. There's sort of a science to it, but I wormed my way through it and was finding that these abbreviation keys help a lot. And so we'll see here that what's going on is it indicates that John 1:1 here is in this category where we have process in the accusative case, right? And it's used with a linking verb, to be, right? The word was prostheos, were with God. And here it says it basically simply means with. So it's basically synonym for the word with. You could think of it as that in this particular case. And I wanted to get that out of the way. There it is, with someone. I wanted to get that out of the way so we can focus on what I think is the true meaning here. Perfect. So God has a purpose from the very beginning, and he says it several times in different ways in the Old Testament. But even beside that, as we mentioned before, the Greeks kind of had a sort of an understanding just from their own thought process that there must be some divine force that's guiding the universe and that is responsible for creation. And they called that the Logos. That was actually the word they used, the same word that John is using here, as a sort of guiding force, the plan and purpose and reason behind the whole, everything we see in the natural world was to them guided by something they called the Logos. So I'm not saying that John derives his Logos from the Greeks. The Greeks were actually all over the board when it comes to what the Logos was or how you define the Logos. They all had sort of slightly different variations of what it meant. I just want to emphasize here, though, that these ideas were floating around already at the time. And this is 600 BC that Heraclitus wrote, right? So starting with Heraclitus, perhaps even earlier, the Greeks began to realize that there was some guiding force. There was some purpose behind all of creation. And we might say, well, that's nice, that's the Greeks, but John was not Greek. But it turns out it's also carried into the Jewish context as well. There's other ways of looking at Logos, and let's say that this seems to be some evidence that Brother Harry Whitaker was either he was purposely ignoring it or he was completely unaware of it, because he doesn't mention it at all. Instead, he seems to think that Christians having the idea that the Logos was an impersonal force or purpose or being, like a personification, if you will. He seemed to think that came from Gnosticism, which it didn't, because he rightly points out Gnosticism came later, but he doesn't seem to realize that these ideas were already floating around in the culture. So Philo was a philosopher living in Alexandria, so he probably would have had access to that great library, the Alexandrian library, full of all kinds of classical Greek works, right? He probably would have had time. I don't think he was a menial laborer, seems to have written a lot of works and been very prolific in his writing. But he would have been immersed in the Greek culture because, being Hellenized and everything, living in Alexandria. Um, and he was also alive, contemporary with Christ. But Philo was a Jew. So what he tended to do is kind of marry Greek thought and Jewish thought together. And Philo seems to have borrowed from Heraclitus and Plato and the Stoics, but he sort of weaved the impersonal logos concept together with some Jewish ideas here. And what's important here also to mention is Philo, though he was contemporary with Christ, he never mentions Christ or Christians. And that's important because he appears probably to have written before John. And there's very little chance that that he was making a commentary on John 1 or anything like that. So this is actually very strong evidence that the concept of logos was in the Jewish culture at the time John wrote, and that the logos was not considered a personal being, but as it says here, a shadow or an image or sort of a pattern more. So, and by the way, Trinitarians don't like it when you point this out. So it's very clear here that Logos sees the word not as a person, but as an impersonal attribute of God, which he says God used this like an instrument. Okay, so it's sort of like you can think of a personification of an instrument. Or an archetype or an image, I think is a very appropriate word to use. So there's proof for you of the cultural context. So other reasons to persuade you that the Logos was God's purpose, or not necessarily in John 1:1 at least, talking about a personal being yet. The scriptural context, right? While reading these, by the way, try to remember wisdom, we know, is not a personal being, yet it speaks a lot. It's given voice, and it's talking about being before God, before the foundations of the world, right? So, but it's not a personal being. Remember that it's personification was a thing in the Hebrew culture. So it's the logos. It's like the purpose. The wisdom was also said to be with God, or here by God, right? From the beginning. What's interesting about this chapter, though, is also a lot of people don't notice that it relates wisdom to the purpose through that word etzah, meaning purpose. And there's a lot of verses that will back that up, that counsel can mean, you get together with people and discuss things, but the word is also used as meaning purpose. And for example, God had brought their counsel to naught in Nehemiah 4:15, and fulfill all thy counsel in Psalm 20 verse 4. And the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he hath determined in Isaiah 19 verse 17, and declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, I shall do all my pleasure. So these words, counsel, meaning purpose, or my plans, what I plan to do, or what are the intentions of God in this case. And Micah 4:12, but they know not the thoughts of the Lord, neither understand they his counsel. for he shall gather them as sheaves to the floor, and so on. So this word, those are just a few examples of etzah, as it says here in the Strong's, it can mean purpose, depending on the context. So what we have here is a direct relation of the purpose with the wisdom that we find, which is dwelling before the foundation of the world with God. So this is not foreign concepts. These are biblical concepts, and even that's even without going into the Apocrypha. When we get into the non-sacred works, there's the same idea where we have these two ideas of wisdom and purpose being interrelated in Ecclesiasticus, in Wisdom of Solomon, in the Sirach, and later in the Pesikta Rabbatai, we'll find some of this Midrash, also the same kinds of ideas. So that the idea was, it was permeating the Jewish culture, and it was definitely scriptural. So it's not like they would have had a hard time understanding these concepts. And furthermore, also, I guess when you get into the Aramaic Targums, we'll find even more writings and more parallels with the Aramaic word memra, which also means the word, not suggesting again that John borrowed from the Targums or anything like that, but only that, just again, that these are sort of witnesses that these ideas were floating around, and they weren't foreign to these people. They understood when John started talking about the Logos. They kind of understood right away what we come around like 2,000 years later trying to figure out what he meant, or even people 100 years later who didn't understand the Jewish culture. That's why the whole Arianism thing probably started, was they didn't understand this culture of what did John mean, with this word made flesh business, right? Now, Harry Whitaker says that in verse 14 here, he says that where it says, this is the NIV, the word became flesh. And in King James, it says the word was made flesh. But he says that it should mean the word was made flesh, meaning that it happened to be composed of flesh, and that verse is a sidebar, like it was just sort of inserted at that point in time to just say, oh, by the way, the word was made flesh, because he sees the word, the Logos, in verse 1 as being Jesus, not the purpose or what became Jesus later. And but the fact is, the word is the same as it is in verse 12. It means became. There's a transition, sort of an idea here. And also, if you look at this language in 1 John 1:1, by the way, it seems to also go along with that statement. It agrees that, so this whole thing about handling the Logos, right? Why would John bother to mention that? If the Logos only ever referred to Jesus and not the purpose that actually became flesh, right? Why would he bother to mention our hands have handled it, the word of life, right? As if there's no reason. It doesn't make sense unless the Logos had before was not flesh, then that when it became flesh, that was the exciting part about being able to actually handle something, because it's a beautiful picture, because you have sort of a blueprint, right? And then you use the blueprint to build a house, or you have a specification, and you You use the specification to create some kind of a product or something. So you have first you have sort of the words and the ideas, and this is like this how it's going to work, and it's all written down somewhere. It's explainable, and then you go and create it, and it's a thing, and you can touch it, right? That's the whole point of this verse. We have, our hands have handled it. The exciting part about it, and unless there was some thought of the logos being just a concept before that, then I don't see the point of this even being mentioned. But I think this question here, right? What was the logos before it came flesh is something that it'd be wise to carefully consider that question, I think. So now, another reason why I look at the logos as God's purpose is something Marco noted last time I gave a class on 1.1c. Marco said that the first verse sets the stage for the rest of the chapter. And in fact, this verse and the chapter has themes that match the entire book of John. And furthermore, several verses in John would be very difficult to explain, right? It would be very difficult to explain if we were in denial about this theme of predestination. And where, you know, these verses about the glory that I had with God, the glory, when Jesus says the glory that I had with you before the world was, how would that make any sense unless it was predestination? Now you get into either pre-existence or predestination, you know, you take your pick. So obviously there's a strong theme of predestination in John already. And what I'm trying to say is this just fits in with all that. And in fact, like Marco, the way Marco put it, sets the stage for that. And I don't know whether, obviously, there's probably going to be some points of disagreement, but I think overall there's a strong theme of predestination in this whole book. And in fact, I did a study one time on all verses that can be used to try to prove pre-existence of Christ, and I think some 95% of them were in John. So to let you know how predominant that theme is in John, it's something that would otherwise be hard to explain unless we knew, like, unless we thought of the logos as a personification. So, and again, according to 1 Peter 1:20, Jesus was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but manifest in these last times for you. And Romans 16:26 mentions the revelation of the mystery, which has been kept secret since the world began, but is made manifest. And this is because, as it says, God calleth those things which be not as though they were, Romans 4:17. And I think that some can, in their fervor to try to stomp out any possibility of interpreting John 1:1 as pre-existence, I think they kind of accidentally dispose of the theme of predestination. It's sort of like, I think, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, almost, kind of an analogy. If you think of also the body of Christ as a temple, you can think of the logos then as the sort of the blueprint, right? The pattern of the temple, or the specifications for that house. And that's the way it makes sense to me. And Um, yeah, I think we're almost up. Otherwise, I would have a big long list of Bible scholars' quotations of how verses in John that are often interpreted as pre-existence were meant in the Jewish mind and in their ideas as actually pertaining to predestination. And but I won't have time to do all those quotes. So maybe you just as well, just know that they exist and a lot of these quotes are by Trinitarians. So we got the hostile witness thing going on very strongly. There's a lot of witness in scholarship that these verses refer to predestination and not preexistence, as they're usually taken when somebody's trying to prove doctrine or whatever. And so I'll just leave off with this. I think this theme of predestination is very strong in John 1, and it's tied in with the theme of being made in God's image and what we call God manifestation. In all of this glorious message of what has been God's counsel from the beginning. And we see it early on. We see it in Genesis, where God said, let us make man in our image, right? And here he is talking about the image of God. God is stamping out his image. And the other theme in this chapter, this God manifestation is most strongly emphasized by Christadelphians. And Jesus was the manifestation of God in flesh, most perfectly. He became the Son of God. So the idea here, though, is in verse 12, we also can become the sons of God. And I think that's kind of what this John 1 is really about, is sort of introducing this gospel in, hey, listen, here's how it works. And there's a blueprint, and Jesus followed it, and you can too. Of course, Jesus is the sort of prototype for us to all touch and handle or see and hear. So that in case you had any problems with interpreting the plans or the specifications, here it is where you can look at it and become one of the sons of God like he did. And so I would just conclude that John 1 has a beautiful message, and I think of the Logos as a blueprint. I think that God stamped his own image into Jesus. As it said, Jesus was the express image of God. And I think that means, of course, morally. And he was in his character, God's image or a replica, or what you'd say is exact duplicate, right? And so that is a picture of the Columbia River Gorge. And I am done.